You want to hear a crazy story? Maybe the craziest thing I've ever done. I'm willing to bet money on this. I hold the world record for the most homeowners association violations ever rectified in a single, beautiful, glorious afternoon. We're talking about 139 of them gone. Poof, vanished in a rush of cold, clean mountain water. So, seriously, drop a comment. Let me know where you're watching from. And buckle up, because this one is a deep dive. It involves my family's 5-generation legacy. A massive lake that was never supposed to exist. An HOA president who genuinely believed she was royalty. And the simple, undeniable, beautiful power of gravity. It all started when the Highlands Crest Estates Homeowners Association decided to build a luxury vacation village right on the edge of my property line. They looked at our private body of water, this massive, shimmering blue jewel in the heart of the Appalachian foothills, and they thought it was their greatest asset. They were wrong. It was, in fact, their biggest, wettest liability because they forgot to ask the one question that mattered before they broke ground. Who controls the water? Spoiler alert, again, I do. And when they pushed me far enough, when they chose arrogance over the law, I just let it go. I opened the sluice gates, metaphorically speaking, and let nature handle the rest. My name is Quinn Vance, and my family has owned this particular stretch of the Appalachian Mountains for well over a century. It's not the ritzy new money kind of ownership, it's the hard scrabble. Dirt dash, under dash, the dash fingernails. Paying dash taxes, dash on, dash rocky, dash land kind of legacy. Back in the 1920s, my great-great-grandfather, Elias Vance, bought over 2,000 acres of what everyone else called undesirable terrain. It was too steep for cotton, too rocky for cattle, and nobody wanted it for farming. But Elias wasn't a farmer. He was a civil engineer. And he saw something nobody else did. Water. Specifically, a narrow, deep gorge on our property where 3 major creeks converged. In 1928, with his own hands, his own financing, and a crew of local men, he built a dam. It wasn't a massive, showy Hoover Dam concrete monolith, it was a deep, respectable, over-engineered cyclopean masonry dam, built entirely from the massive stone pulled right out of the land. That dam changed everything. It created a 700-acre lake where there was once only a muddy, meandering valley. He named it Lake Serafina after my great-great-grandmother. And that's where I live today. In the old stone and timber lodge built high on a promontory overlooking his creation, the dam was more than just a pretty view. It was a masterpiece of early 20th century flood control and, theoretically, hydroelectric power, though the turbines never went in. For generations, we were the quiet custodians of this land. We paid our taxes, we maintained the dam, and we fiercely guarded our solitude. The deed, the land, the lake bed, and most crucially, the riparian rights, the rights governing the control and use of the water itself, were ironclad. They belonged to the Vance Trust, my trust. Fast forward to about 4 years ago, and the world finally discovered our quiet corner. A massive developer, Pinnacle Ventures, bought a 1,000-acre parcel. Adjacent to ours land we had sold off back in the 70s just to cover some crippling estate taxes. They carved it up into a gated, high-end resort-style community, Highlands Crest Estates. At first, I didn't care. I'm a quiet guy up the hill in the old stone house. People have a right to live where they want. But then came Deborah Ellington. She was the inaugural HOA president, a woman in her early 60s who drove a white Bentley SUV and wore expensive linen resort wear, as if she were perpetually sipping mimosas on a veranda in Monaco, not sweating in the Appalachian foothills. She had the kind of brittle, sun-damaged smile that simply did not reach her eyes. She looked at our land not as a place of history, but as an amenity to be aggressively exploited and monetized. Deborah saw, Lake Serafina as the glittering crown jewel of her new kingdom. It was right there in their name, Highlands. Crest. She started treating it as if it were hers immediately. First came the passive-aggressive newsletters. The board reminds all residents to enjoy the beautiful community lake responsibly. Then came the direct emails addressed to me, the old man up the hill. The HOA board has noticed your personal dock is in dire need of aesthetic updating. Please see attached bylaws for approved color palettes, or we will be forced to hire a contractor. I replied politely but firmly. I told her that the HOA's authority ended precisely at my well-marked boundary, and that the aesthetic of my century-old dock was frankly none of her business. For Deborah, a woman whose entire persona was predicated on unquestioned, absolute authority, this was an unbearable gauntlet thrown down. The idea that this scruffy, quiet man in his 40s, later referred to as the reclusive mountain hermit, which I overheard at the local hardware store could defy her, was unacceptable. She saw a bachelor who inherited some land. She didn't see a man who happened to be a hydrological engineer who had spent his entire life studying, maintaining, and understanding the very dam that gave her a lake view. She consistently and fatally underestimated me. That was her first mistake. Her second mistake was much, much bigger. It involved 139 cabins, a truly magnificent piece of fraudulent paperwork, and a complete disregard for the law, both man-made and natural. The escalation began, as these things always do, with a simple fence. I hired a professional crew and had the entire 2,000-acre parcel properly surveyed and marked every few hundred feet with discreet, bright orange flags and official iron pins. I wasn't being aggressive. I was being precise. I believe in good fences making good neighbors. Deborah, however, seemed to believe that good neighbors were ones who immediately ceded their property for her. Convenience. Her first major move was to announce the Highlands Crest Community Waterfront Recreation Area. The map in there? Glossy monthly newsletter was beautifully rendered, showing a sandy beach, a fishing pier, a volleyball court, and a kayak launch. It was a lovely plan. It was also, every inch of it, entirely on my land. I sent her a detailed cease and desist letter via my lawyer, Old Man Hazacom. Firm document that pointed out the clear property lines on the county plat and included a copy of my recent survey. Her response was immediate and dismissive. "We are relying on our own more recent plat map," she wrote back, radiating confidence, which shows a discrepancy. This was news to me. I drove down to the county records office, and there it was, a newly filed survey map for Highlands Crest Estates. It was a masterpiece of subtle forgery. The surveyor, a name I'd never seen before, had ever so slightly shifted the boundary line, jogging it out a few hundred feet along the entire length of the lake. It was just enough to absorb exactly 50 acres of my prime, gentle shoreline, including the cove where they planned their beach. The document looked official. It had a seal, but I knew it was wrong. My family's deeds went back a century. So I did what any engineer does when faced with a lie. I gathered data. I pulled the original 1920s deeds, the 1970s sale documents, and my own recent survey. Then I spent a grueling weekend with my high-precision GPS rover. Reshot every single boundary. Marker myself, the result was a point cloud of irrefutable data that proved with sub-centimeter accuracy that the HOA's map was a fiction. The real kicker. I looked up the surveyor listed on their fraudulent plat. The man had lost his license 2 years prior for falsifying documents in a commercial zoning case. He was legally barred from submitting any plans at all. That, right there, was my smoking gun. I compiled everything into a neat, damning report and sent it to Deborah and the entire board. I thought naively that this irrefutable proof of fraud would be the end of it. I expected a sheepish apology, a retraction, maybe a check for my lawyer fees. I underestimated her ego. Deborah's response was to double down with absolute, terrifying confidence. At the next HOA meeting, which I attended as a deeply amused observer, she held up my report and called it a campaign of harassment by a disgruntled local. She waved her fraudulent map and declared, "This is our community. This is our lake. We will not be bullied by an isolationist." The assembled homeowners, most of whom just wanted a nice, quiet place to live, applauded dutifully. Her enablers on the board a collection of yes-men, who were clearly intoxicated by their proximity to her power nodded in solemn agreement. They voted to proceed with the construction of the recreation area immediately. The bulldozers arrived the following Monday. I filmed them from my porch as they crossed my property line, tearing up the earth and felling 100-year rolled oak trees. I called the county sheriff. When the young deputy arrived, he was met by Deborah and the HOA's slick corporate lawyer. They showed him their fraudulent map. I showed him my authentic survey. The deputy was completely stuck. He looked from one map to the other and finally just sighed. "Sir, ma'am, this is a civil dispute. It's a property line disagreement. You'll have to take it to court," which is exactly what Deborah was counting on. She knew litigation could take years and cost a fortune. She was betting I didn't have the stomach, the resources, or the sheer stubbornness to fight her corporate-backed machine. She was wrong again. I filed for an immediate injunction, but as she had planned, the court docket was backed up. The soonest we could get a preliminary hearing was 6 months away. 6 months. In her mind, possession was 10/10 of the law. She didn't just build a beach in that 6-month window. She went for the absolute gold. She announced Phase 2, the Serafina Retreat Cabins, an exclusive collection of rustic luxury waterfront rentals, 139 of them, to be exact, clustered along the very 50 acres of shoreline she had just stolen. These weren't little shacks. They were prefabricated, high-end units with plumbing, electricity, and HVAC set on concrete slab foundations. Her final brazen gamble was that by the time we got to court, the cabins would be a fait accompli, done deal and no judge would ever order the demolition of a multi-million-dollar investment. It was a shocking escalation. It was also the beginning of the end for her. Because while she was focused on bulldozers and concrete, I was focused on history, on water, and on the fine print of a deed signed almost 100 years ago. She was building on the shore of Lake Serafina. But she had forgotten that the lake answered to me. The construction was a whirlwind of noise, dust, and arrogance. Every morning, I watched the fleet of trucks rumble past the turnoff to my lodge, kicking up clouds of dirt. They worked with incredible speed, a testament to what you can accomplish when you ignore trivial things like permits, environmental impact studies, and property rights. The 139 cabins sprouted like ugly rectangular mushrooms along my shoreline. They were packed in tight, a parody of the spacious nature they were meant to celebrate. Deborah was a constant. Smug presence on site, directing from the seat of her white Bentley. A queen surveying the expansion of her empire. She would sometimes drive up to the edge of the construction zone nearest my house, stop, and just stare up at my lodge. It was a silent, daily taunt. "See, I'm winning. What are you going to do about it, Mr. Vance?" What I was doing was spending my days in my great-grandfather's study and my nights in the pump house at the base of the dam. The study was a treasure trove. Elias Vance was a meticulous record keeper. I found his original engineering blueprints for the dam, his hand-penned calculations on flow rates, spillway capacity, and structural integrity. But the most important discovery was his journal, tucked into a passage from 1928. "I found what I was looking for," he wrote. "The lake reaches its fullest natural extent at an elevation of 1,845 feet above sea level. This is the natural high water mark dictated by the topography of the valley. for safety and recreational use. I have engineered the primary sluice gates to maintain the water level at a constant 1,838 feet. However, the structure and the spillway are designed to easily withstand the full 1,845-foot level in the event of a generational flood. 7 feet. That was the magic number. 7 vertical feet of elevation difference between the lake's current, artificially maintained recreational level and its true, natural shoreline. 7 feet that Elias had engineered as a safety buffer. 7 feet of pure, liquid justice. I pulled out my topographical maps and my survey data and started plotting. My own land, including my lodge, was well above the 1,850-foot contour line. But the 50 acres Deborah had stolen, the land where her 139 cabins were being hastily erected. It was a gentle, beautiful slope. The lowest cabin foundations were sitting at 1,839 feet. The highest were just shy of 1,844 feet. They were all nestled comfortably within my 7-foot buffer. They were all, technically, in the lake bed. My next step was the dam itself. The mechanics were simple, a testament to 1920s engineering. The primary controls for the 2 main sluice gates were a pair of massive screen wheel valves located in a cool concrete tunnel running through the heart of the dam. They were manually operated. Turning those wheels was an exhausting workout. Took hundreds of rotations to fully open or close the gates. It was a deliberate design to prevent accidental or sudden changes. Slow, ponderous, and utterly unstoppable. I spent a week down there, inspecting every gear, greasing every fitting, checking the seals. The mechanism was in perfect working order. A silent, powerful machine just waiting for a command. While the HOA was busy pouring concrete, I was preparing my legal case. We drafted a final formal letter. It was a masterpiece of legal prose. It informed Highlands Crest Estates, HOA, that they had illegally constructed 139 structures on my private property, specifically within the designated flood easement of the Lake Serafina Dam. It stated that for urgent and necessary structural inspections and maintenances recommended by a hydrological engineer, me. Of course, the lake would need to be temporarily returned to its documented natural maximum elevation of 1,845 feet. It gave them a deadline, 48 hours to evacuate any personnel and remove any property from the clearly demarcated easement zone. We sent it via certified mail with a signature required. I knew Deborah would sign for it. I pictured her reading it, scoffing, and tossing it into the trash. Another piece of harassment from the man up the hill. And that's exactly what she did. The day after the letter was delivered, they started moving in furniture. The morning of the deadline was calm and overcast. A gentle mist hung over the lake, muffling the sounds of the construction crew as they put the finishing touches on the cabins. They were installing curtains, stacking firewood on the tiny porches. It had a surreal, almost theatrical quality. They were literally dressing the set for a disaster movie. My 48-hour notice had been completely ignored, just as I knew it would be. I received no calls, no emails. Just the arrogant silence of people who believe rules don't apply to them at 9 a.m. The exact moment the deadline expired, I drove my truck down to the dam. I had a thermos of black coffee, a portable speaker playing some classic rock ZZ Top, beyond a sense of grim, methodical purpose. Before I started, I made 2 calls. The first was to the sheriff's office. I informed the dispatcher that as the owner and operator of the Lake Serafina Dam, I was commencing a standard non-emergency maintenance procedure that would involve slowly raising the water level to the documented Lehigh water mark of 1,845 feet over the next 12 to 24 hours. I confirmed all adjacent property owners had been notified in writing. The dispatcher was confused, but she made a note of it. My second call was to Old Man Hayes, my lawyer. "It's time, counselor," I said. "Godspeed, Quinn," he replied, his voice crackling with dry amusement. "I've got the injunction paperwork ready to file Monday morning, citing their failure to vacate the easement as proof of immediate and irreparable harm. But somehow, I don't think we'll need it." Then I went to work. I entered the cool, echoing concrete gallery of the dam. The air smelled of damp stone and old machinery. I walked to the first massive wheel valve, the one controlling the primary north gate. I put my hands on the cold iron, took a deep breath, and began to turn. It was stiff at first, resisting decades of static peace. Then, with a groan of metal and a deep shudder that I felt through the soles of my boots, it started to move. The gearing system whined to life, a low, powerful sound that vibrated through the structure. Outside, deep beneath the surface of the lake, a multi-ton steel gate was slowly, inch by inch, beginning to slide upward, reducing the outflow of the creeks that fed the lake. I turned and turned and turned. It was exhausting work. I switched to the second wheel for the south gate and repeated the process. For the next 3 hours, I moved between the two wheels, steadily, methodically, cranking them open, following the operational sequence outlined in my great-grandfather's notes. I wasn't just dumping the lake. I was curtailing its exit. The dam wasn't failing. It was functioning perfectly, precisely as it had been designed to. It was simply obeying a new command. The 3 creeks that fed Lake Serafina now poured more water in than the partially closed gates were letting out. The lake began to rise. It was almost imperceptible at first. An inch, then another. If you weren't watching for it, you wouldn't notice. But I was watching. I left the gallery and went to my favorite vantage point, the promontory near my lodge. I had a pair of powerful binoculars and a spotting scope. Around noon, I saw the first sign. The water, which normally lapped a good 20 feet away from the lowest row of cabins, was now gently touching the edge of the new, hastily laid turf by 1 p.m. The water was covering their tiny front yards. The construction crew, returning from their lunch break, were the first to notice. I saw a group of them standing and pointing. One foreman was frantically talking into his phone. They probably assumed it was a natural fluctuation. An hour later, they were no longer shrugging. The water was now licking at the concrete slabs of the first tier of cabins. I could see the men running, gesticulating wildly, pulling tools and equipment away from the rising shoreline. Panic is a contagion. It spread as Deborah Ellington's white Bentley pulled up. She got out, hands on her hips, her body language radiating pure, unadulterated fury. She clearly thought this was some trick, some temporary plumbing issue I'd engineered. She marched toward the water's edge, her expensive sandals sinking into the now soggy ground. The water was visibly rising now, creeping up the sides of the foundations. It wasn't a wave. It was a slow, inexorable tide. I watched her through the scope. I couldn't hear her shouting from this distance, but I could imagine it. It was the sound of someone whose entire world, built on bluff and bluster, was dissolving in front of her. By 4 p.m., the lowest cabins were islands. The water was halfway up their doors. Electrical systems were shorting out with faint, pathetic pops. Pallets of unused building materials floated away like tiny barges. The sight was biblical. Nature wasn't raging. It was just calmly, quietly reclaiming its own. This wasn't a flood. It was an eviction, and the water kept rising. Higher and higher it climbed, claiming cabin after cabin, a silent, liquid tide of consequence. The fallout was spectacular, and it unfolded exactly as I knew it would by evening. The water level had risen by nearly 5 feet. It swamped the first 4 rows of cabins completely, filling them with murky lake water, ruining drywall, flooring, and the brand-new furniture. The highest cabins had water halfway up their walls. The entire Serafina Retreat development. Deborah's multi-million-dollar monument to her own hubris. Was a waterlogged disaster zone. My phone started ringing. Lawyers. Investors. The developer's VP bot. I let it ring. Just after sunset. The sheriff's deputy, the same young guy from the property line dispute, showed up at the end of my driveway. He was joined by a frantic, sputtering Deborah. He's flooding us out. He's destroying our property. Arrest him. She was screeching, pointing a trembling, manicured finger up toward my lodge. The deputy walked up to my porch, looking utterly exhausted. "Sir," he said, rubbing his temples, "Miss Ellington here is making some pretty serious accusations." I just smiled calmly, handed him a cold bottle of water, and gave him the full tour. I showed him the certified mail receipt for the notice we had sent 48 hours earlier. I showed him my great-grandfather's blueprints, the deed specifying my riparian rights, and the section of the operational manual detailing the procedure for raising the lake to the 1,845-foot high-water mark for maintenance. Explained that I was the dam's legal operator and was performing a long-overdue structural integrity test, a procedure for which I had both a professional obligation as an engineer and a legal right as the owner. I pointed down at the submerged cabins. "Deputy," I said, my voice calm, "as far as I'm concerned, all I see is an unauthorized debris field that someone illegally dumped in my lake's flood easement. I gave them 48 hours notice to remove it. They chose not to." He looked at my meticulous documentation. Then he looked down the hill at the shrieking mess Deborah had become, and the truth finally dawned on him. He wasn't looking at a crime scene. He was looking at a self-inflicted wound. He walked back down and, for the third and final time, told her this was a civil matter. The look on her face, illuminated by the flashing lights of his cruiser, was a glorious cocktail of impotent rage and dawning catastrophic horror. The aftermath was a slow-motion demolition derby of finances and reputations. The investors behind Pinnacle Ventures, who had backed Deborah's aggressive expansion, were horrified. Their insurance company took one look at the situation: the fraudulent survey, the lack of permits, the blatant construction within a documented flood easement, and they denied the claim, labeling it gross negligence. The homeowners in Highlands Crest Estates, who had paid a huge premium for a lake view, were now faced with a swamp of half-submerged, rotting cabins and the realization that their HOA president had led them into a legal and financial quagmire. The class action lawsuits started to fly, not just against Deborah and the HOA, but against the developers, the construction company, and the now-defunct surveyor. Deborah's little kingdom crumbled. She was voted out in a humiliating emergency meeting. Her white Bentley was seen leaving the gated community for the last time a week later, never to return. The HOA itself went bankrupt trying to settle the lawsuits. The developers cut their losses and sold the remaining land for pennies on the dollar to a conservation trust. But for me, the story wasn't quite over. I left the water at the full 1,845-foot level for a complete month. I wanted to make a point. And I wanted the lake water to do its work, soaking into every joint, warping every board, and filling those cabins with a permanent layer of silt and muck. When I was satisfied, I returned to the dam and over another 12 hours, slowly lowered the water back to its normal recreational level of 1,838 feet. The scene that was revealed was one of utter devastation. The 139 cabins were a total wreck. Mold had taken hold, windows were broken, and a foul stench hung in the air. The HOA and the developers officially declared bankruptcy and abandoned them. And so, I was left with 139 derelict structures on my land. I hired a salvage crew and a demolition team. We spent the better part of a year tearing them down, hauling away the debris and remediating the land. It was a massive, expensive cleanup. but I paid for it all by selling the scrap metal, salvaged components, and by winning a significant court judgment against the developer's parent company for trespass and damages. Once the last cabin was gone, I brought in a landscape architect who specialized in ecosystem restoration. We replanted the entire 50-acre stretch with native trees, shrubs, and grasses. We restored the natural contours of the shoreline. Within 2 years, you couldn't even tell the cabins had ever been there. The oak trees are growing back, the birds have returned, and the quiet has settled back over Lake Serafina. Sometimes, new residents from the chastened, reorganized HOA will paddle by in a canoe and wave up at my lodge. They know the story. They know who owns the lake, and they know who controls the water. I never set out to be a villain or a hero. I just wanted to be left alone on the land my family had cared for a century. Deborah and her HOA saw my heritage as a commodity and my patience as weakness. They learned that some lines shouldn't be crossed, and that nature, when properly directed, is the ultimate arbiter of justice. And that's how I fixed 139 HOA violations in one go. So, thanks for listening to my story. I'm curious to hear your take on this. Was I justified in using the power of the dam to defend my property, or did I go too far? Is there a line between defending your rights and delivering overwhelming retribution? Let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe if you want to hear more stories about fighting back against the system, and I'll catch you on the next one.